Hello, and welcome to another episode of Captive Minds. I'm Max Perry. I'm an independent journalist based in Baltimore, and I will be your host for the day. My work is currently featured in Covert Action magazine, and you can check out my writing there. And with me, as always, is my co-host and our producer out in Oregon, Shaenah Batterson. Hi, Shaenah.
Hi, Max. I'm excited to do another episode.
Yeah, I think we've got a pretty interesting topic for the day. Shayna's work is also now featured in CAM as well. So you can check out her work there. And then she's also got a Substack page called The Red Letter. And she also, by the way, put together that montage at the beginning, which we should credit, features a song called Inside the System by Bergsonist, who is a New York-based electronic artist. So, yeah, Shayna put together that montage for our theme today, which is, well, today we're going to be discussing something I think everyone sort of takes for granted, or rather, it's become such a part of everyday life, even what we're doing right now, that people don't stop to think about it as much as they should. And more importantly, I think a lot of people are sort of ignorant about its origins. I mean, it is a big topic of discussion, the way that Silicon Valley and big tech, and these mega rich, mega wealthy oligarchs, their influence in the government with people like Zuckerberg and Bezos and Elon Musk, of course. But I don't think as much attention is really given to the nature of the origins of the internet, which has produced this new class of oligarchs and members of the ruling class that are exerting incredible influence over the government. And I don't think many people don't really fully comprehend or question the whole societal impact of the internet because, our lives revolve around it now so ubiquitously. And as a result of that over familiarity, I think its real purpose, or at least the way in which it's used as a means of social control, gets lost in the conversation because the way it has, at least on the surface, at least, improved or enhanced our lives to such a degree that, I mean, it's a double-edged sword. There's been many ways in which it's improved our lives, but then in other ways, it's sort of slowly destroying our lives, for lack of a better way of putting it. But I think that the sort of origins of it and where it comes from and its ties to the military and that's sort of gotten lost. And a lot of these big figures like Bezos and Musk and Zuckerberg have been demonized, and rightly so, and have become, pretty maligned figures. But even in their case, I don't think enough attention has been given to the origins of these Silicon Valley tech monopolies and the advent of social networks and big tech giants. I don't think
I
enough
don't,
attention has been given to the sort of military origins. So we wanted to
well,
get into that today.
I just want to add too, I don't know if many people are aware of it, but Facebook originally sort of Zuckerberg's precursor to it was, I believe when he was in college, he made this program and it was like called Face Smash, and where you could post different pictures of the of college girls and like rate them whether you'd smash them or not.
Yeah, I mean that was covered a little bit, I think, in the that movie, The Social Network, which is one of the most boring movies I've ever seen. I don't understand why people liked it. But I do think some of that is known, but yeah, not to the degree to which, I mean, yeah, it was this thing that was part of university frat culture that, just took over and became dominated all of our lives. So some of the backstory I think is known, but not certainly not quite as much as the intimate relationship between these platforms and the military industrial complex and the intelligence community. And I think before we can even address that question, one has to kind of look at, I mean, there's another conversation to be had whether or not the internet belongs in the public domain, which obviously I think it does, the way it's been increasingly privatized, even though it's a public utility, it's so much, I mean, it's so required to even be able to function as a human now that it makes no sense that it's not free and that it's not regarded as a public utility like running water or electricity. I mean, it's just something that, in my opinion, should be if it's going to be take over our lives in such a coercive way, it should be, there should be public ownership over it. But I think before we even get into that question, you have to look at its roots, which, like I was saying, is a very neglected topic. And I think if you look at its roots, it actually supports the argument to be made for it to be under public ownership. And, a lot of that is because, Silicon Valley propaganda likes to take credit for these technological innovations like the advent of the internet or the smartphone even, and credit it all to entrepreneurship and free enterprise, when if you look at the technology itself as an innovation, even with something like smartphones, the research by scientists that went into developing that technology came from state investment, not the private sector. I mean, if you take an iPhone, like I've got here, and you were to, break it down by its essential components, not just its ability to access the internet, but the touch screen technology, the GPS system built in, its battery, its hard drive, voice recognition technology, all of that comes from research done by computer scientists who got government grants. None of the components of a smartphone, like like their essential technology, was invented by Apple or the free market. And it's the same with the internet itself, really. And and so I think that in and of itself lends supports the argument why it should be publicly owned, because it was state funding, using taxpayer money that developed this stuff in the first place, and it's just been privatized. But the internet specifically, if you look at its origins, it can be traced to the period in American history, post-war period, when the United States was in direct competition with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And, the Soviets really, for all intents and purposes, had won the space race. I mean, I know that the US made it to the moon. I know even bringing this up is going to cue in the comments section a debate whether or not that actually happened. That's not the purpose of our episode today. Maybe we'll do that one day in the future, but regardless, if you look at the space race, literally every other signature accomplishment, whether the first human, the first animal, first woman, it was all first achieved by the Soviets. And it was the Soviet launching of Sputnik that really set into motion like this big overhaul in federal funding for scientific research. And the U.S. realized that there was a significant aspect to the Cold War, that it wasn't just about an arms race, that there was also the space race had real significance as well. And so there was a big overhaul in federal funding for research, and that led to the creation of what later became DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which I guess was originally called Advanced Research Projects Agency Network, or ARPANET. And this was the research and development arm or branch of the Defense Department. And this is, the real military origins of the internet. And they pulled together people from academia and yes, also the private sector, as government contractors, and they invested heavily in computer infrastructure. And this took place at universities and other research facilities. And they built this sharing network of computers that was basically like the nucleus of what later became the internet, where they connected these compute. Of course, at the time, computers were enormous. They were like the size of like entire rooms. Um,
And
and
now they can be so tiny.
yeah, it's crazy. And so they built this network, ARPANET, that connected one computer to the other, and that was the groundwork for what later became the internet.
Yeah, can I talk about that for just a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
Some of the impetus, a lot of the impetus for the creation of that, because it was sort of a way to connect the different computers together and for like being able to look at and collate data. It was in the context of the Vietnam War, and because this war was, you know, guerrilla and civilian forces,
Hmm.
the fighters really knew the land, and the US imperialist army, they were struggling with this war. And so I know they were like sending anthropologists to study the people there, and they had a lot of data and information coming in, and that this sort of impetus to develop this sort of precursor to the internet was to have a way to collect this information and be able to go through all this data better. ARPA, ARPA also dealt in counterinsurgency programs. So, and one of its ARPA's biggest projects is actually the surveillance operation called Project Igloo White, which was a multi-million-dollar endeavor that involved bugging the Vietnamese jungle with seismic activity monitors, microphones, heat and
Wow.
urine sensors, etc. So,
Wow.
so there's this. You could almost say there's like the internet is has this anti-communist and origin story.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't know that. I mean, I guess it makes sense given the time period. But yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting also to think about that period because, during the in the midst of the Vietnam War, that's when the moon landings took place. And speaking of the moon landings, there was a interesting article that came out last year that set off a firestorm on my own personal social media when I shared it, because of course, like anything related to the moon landing, as I was saying earlier, just sets off conspiracies and people debating, whether this actually happened and all that. But
There's
talking,
even there's even that movie last year about that was like making
yeah,
fun of people that thought it was fake.
yeah. Well, it's become such a part of popular culture, really. And I went down that rabbit hole. I watched the documentaries that guy Bart Seibel made, including the one where he confronts Buzz Aldrin like on the street in Malibu when he's like coming out of like a ritzy hotel, and he tries to get him. Basically, there's this documentary that this guy made who's like the main moon landing conspiracy theorist, and he basically does this like ambush journalism where he tries to get all the Apollo astronauts to like swear on a Bible, that they went to the moon. And, most of them slam the door in his face. I think it's Neil Armstrong actually invites him in his house, and they like have a debate in his living room. But when he confronts Buzz Aldrin on the street, Buzz Aldrin just clocks him right in the jaw, which is pretty funny. But so like when I shared this article, the article was not, it's not, we'll put it in a link to it, but you can take issue with like its dismissal of people questioning things like COVID or the moon landings or whatever it is. We're certainly not proponents of smearing conspiracy theorists on this podcast, but the more important thing with this article is highlighting is the fact that this era, like that produced not just something like the space program, but also the internet, the military origins of the internet, that massive overhaul in government spending, it is such a bygone era and such a past relic that it's like inconceivable to even think that we would do that now. Because I mean, obviously, with something like the moon landings, the last of which happened in 1972, I believe, we haven't been back since. I mean, the government is completely unwilling to spend that kind of money on this kind of research that produces a technological innovation like the internet. And this article gets into look at what's happened since. I mean, that was a massive undertaking in infrastructure and science and research. And of course, it was driven by this imperialist, desire to compete with the Soviets. But like the thought of their doing anything like that now is inconceivable. And since then, the article talks about how the industrial base that was really a requisite for that to even take place, that has since been eroded. The U.S. has been deindustrialized. Its manufacturing output has been outsourced, and that sort of era in the United States of like investing in massive infrastructure and state funding is just completely like something of the past. And so this article gets into how the absence of that and this like sort of public yearning for this past era that's like that we're so separated from is like sort of fuels a lot of the uh, conspiracies about the moon landing, and sort of understandably so, because we can't even fathom the US actually spending money on something like space travel or space exploration, especially since now it's all in the hands of things like SpaceX and Elon Musk and all these people. The idea of like the government, I mean, NASA is now being cut, and so it just feels like this golden age in America that's come and gone, regardless of what your feelings are about, the moon landings.
No,
Um,
it's gonna, I feel like it's gonna become very, Philip K. Dickian, where you have like the private company that has their planet
yeah,
mines on other
like Total
planets
Recall.
now, and
Yeah, like Elon Musk is Velos Kohagen from Total Recall. Wants to colonize Mars. I mean, that's literally what he is. And so my point is that, of course, we're willing to spend a gargantuan amount of money on the military in terms of like, weapons and stuff like that. But this golden age of America no longer exists. But this is the era that really produced the technological innovations that led to the internet. And the article talks about how like the engineering and heavy industry that went into the Apollo program, that's all since been eroded by globalization and the deindustrialization of the US economy. And so the internet comes from that same period where the government was actually investing in human progress and technological infrastructure, which to me underscores exactly why something like the internet should be a non-proprietary, for the public good, not for profit. And in the decades after that, as the information superhighway, I mean, it's so corny, but as that grew, so to speak, where it originally connected computers at government facilities and universities, its use was primarily for education and research purposes. Eventually, it gave way to market forces, and not coincidentally, when it did that was really right when the Cold War was ending. I don't think it's a coincidence. That's the exact period when it, ceded to the private sector. And the US government transferred what was called the National Science Foundation Network to commercial providers, which led to the internet's, widespread commercialization and privatization. And there was, a very landmark bill that was really kind of like a watershed moment. It was the 1996 Telecommunications Act passed under Bill Clinton. And that act had many negative effects on telecommunications in general, not just like in terms of like privatizing the public airwaves, but in general, in terms of deregulating the exchange of electronic communications, it also impacted the internet, which was, it really, the Telecommunications Act really promoted deregulation. And this was at the exact moment that its usage was made more accessible and it was popularized and it was widespread. So at the very moment, it became available, I mean, I remember my own family at that time. My father worked at a university, brought the computer home and set up the internet, and we were all like totally blown away. Um, I mean, it's not a good thing, or it's not a bad thing that it was democratized and suddenly became available to everybody, like, and was in suddenly in everyone's home like a television set. But it was at the exact moment that it was made available to the public in terms of mass distribution, that's also the exact same moment that it was privatized. And I don't think it's a coincidence that at the very moment it shifted in the early 19 in the 1990s to commercial activity, the Cold War had come to an end, and with the conclusion of the Cold War, I think the incentive or any remaining incentive for the government to invest in public planning or any of the what we were talking about earlier with the massive amount of spending on the space race to keep pace with the Soviets, that sort of died with the Cold War. And of course, this technological revolution that brought the internet into every household, like I was saying, that's not an inherently negative thing, but it was not introduced into every American home like being provided as like a public utility. It was rather it became a an infrastructure primarily held by private companies. And so I think that that kind of changed the very nature of it as, this thing that could be, as a tool that could be used for something good. It suddenly, at that very moment became something that was also going to be used as an instrument to control the population, surveil the population, and not something really democratic and for everyone to share. And it was another avenue in which members of the ruling class could, enrich themselves. And now we have I mean, look at all these big tech oligarchs. The way that they've amassed their wealth. They're like new industrialists. On par with like, the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and all these. I mean, although those people, I think, were even richer, probably ratio wise. I'm not sure. I think that they probably were in terms of amassing wealth, but it's the same thing. This new innovation came, and these people enrich themselves off of it. And I think people sort of take this history for granted and don't realize that this thing that the technology itself was developed, using taxpayer money and state funding, and it was just handed over to the private sector, and they have complete control over it.
Yeah, and those are good points you're making about the end of the Cold War. I think too it's interesting because the whole sort of internet age really came about after the collapse of the Soviet Union and occurred at sort of the same time as the ensuing neoliberal globalization. And just as neoliberal globalization was sort of painted as this democratizing of the world, the end of history, whatever, the ubiquity of the internet was painted in a similar way. But in many ways, the sort of internet age sort of symbolized like American hegemony in a way because the internet has been used as a tool of imperialist power, which interestingly, it seems like actually the Chinese leadership had an early understanding of this. You know, there have been a lot of criticisms of what's called the Great Firewall of China because they've tried to have control over their internet within their country.
Mhm.
But you know, this doesn't seem so crazy when one realizes that the US has been using the internet as a weapon to undermine national sovereignty and promote regime change. For example, starting in 2004, the CIA set up around 885 websites, like mundane and random websites like Star Wars fan pages, which were actually a cover for spy terminals. So the web page could be used by agents in other countries if they logged on with the correct password, and then the website would reveal a secret messaging interface. And these sorts of websites have been used by agents in countries like Iran and China to pass on sensitive information.
Yeah, well, I know that especially with the advent of social networks, that um, there have been several instances in which, I mean, the Arab Spring was really one of the main ones where uh, Twitter, which was in its nascent phase, was used to, I mean, we know that these tech giants have very close ties with the intelligence community, which I'll get into more detail in a second. But in response to what you're saying, um, it's absolutely been used for regime change purposes. And in the case of the Arab Spring, they really, the algorithm can be manipulated and it can be curated and it can be weaponized to promote things like social movements and protest movements and spread the word about something that can begin organically, like in the case of the Arab Spring, like in Egypt and Tahrir Square, or the way it spread to other places that were, um, the U.S. really targeted for the regime change, like Libya and Syria, for example. And also, there was a big attempt in Iran, actually in 2009, and we know that the State Department and the intelligence agencies were using these social networks to try and spread these protest movements and exert outside influence on something that might have started out organically, for their own purposes. It's a weapon of soft power. They've definitely manipulated and turned it into something that they can use to engineer outcomes that they want. And they can also use it, obviously in turn to suppress information. And of course, we know all about the widespread censorship on big tech. It's was supposed to democratize the spreading of information, but it's something that's heavily curated. Certain voices are elevated over others, and there's a revolving door between these big tech giants and Silicon Valley tech monopolies and social media platforms and the intelligence community. There, a lot of them are hiring former people in the intelligence community to serve on content moderation, in advisory capacities, in risk management, or whatever they call it. I mean, there's a very close, intimate relationship, and these intelligence agencies have a big stake in, especially since it's so ubiquitous, it's part of everybody's life, and the technology itself can perform a level of surveillance that the National Security Agency or any of these big intelligence agencies couldn't dream of, with just their manpower. These interfaces, these big, something like Facebook or X is a compendium of information and data stored about people that no NSA, program could possibly keep up with. So they, there's definitely backdoor dealings going on between these tech companies. They're not, I mean, a lot of attention is given to how these companies like Facebook are turning around and selling your data to private companies for advertising and all that. Everybody knows about that, but it is not discussed as much about how much something like X or Instagram or any of these other applications are taking your information and are sharing it with law enforcement or with intelligence agencies. That hasn't gotten nearly as much attention. And that's exactly why I wanted to get into uh, Silicon Valley and the origins of these big tech giants, also like Google, which has connections to the intelligence community and its origins. And this is very much tied to the surveillance state and the way cyberspace has become a mechanism to expand surveillance and track individuals online. And if you look at the origins of something like Google, for example, from the very beginning, even in the way that, like I was saying about the advent of personal computers being brought into homes, like the television set, the intelligence community wanted to have a hand in shaping that innovation to suit its agenda of mass surveillance. And in the
But
1990s, go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say, but there's and I wanted to share this old Apple advertisement for the one of the early Apple computers is because
Mhm.
there's been a conscious effort to make like a smartphone or a computer appear as a tool of individual liberation and that's something you can use. You have all these like cyber libertarians, something you can use to fight surveillance and to fight Big Brother.
Mhm.
Just another example of how Orwell can be used, however. But when in fact, these same companies, a lot of them are in bed with the CIA and these other sort of government agencies. So I'm just gonna share that advertisement really quickly.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the Information Purification Directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory thoughts. Our unification of thoughts is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, they really have sold it that way, but yeah, it's so ironic the way, I mean, how manipulative advertisements can be. They're doing the very thing that they're saying they're not. And yeah, I mean, it's really true that, I mean, and that's pre-internet, or pre-internet being in, publicly available. And I think that they realized that computers could perform in terms of data collecting what no group of intelligence officers at the NSA or the CIA or whatever could ever hope to keep up with in terms of acquiring data, compiling it, and then making sense of it. And I think in the 1990s, at the very moment I was talking about earlier, when the internet began to move from universities and government facilities into the private sector and then also people's homes, I think the intelligence community saw like a really like a golden opportunity, a chance of a lifetime in terms of intelligence gathering in the surveillance state. And this, of course, only multiplied with the advent of social networks and social media applications like Facebook, which, like I was saying, they're a compendium of data about individuals worldwide that, you know, the NSA couldn't dream of compiling. And that's exactly why you have a secretive relationship between intelligence services and these big social media companies. They're not just selling your data, with you as a product to private companies for advertising, but they're also providing access to that information to the security state, with no transparency whatsoever. And of course, yeah, there's no definitive proof per se of like a collaboration between intel agencies and like a company like, excuse me, now it's called Meta, sorry, not Facebook, but there's a lot of indications of indirect ties and they're working together. I mean, simply based on the fact that Meta has been known to hire a significant number of individuals with intelligence backgrounds to work for them, whether they're from the State Department, the CIA, or the Pentagon. We know that intelligence agencies are using Facebook's data and advertising tools for surveillance and information gathering. But Facebook, hiring these people, these former intelligence operatives to work in various capacities, it raises a lot of questions about their prior experience and how much these intelligence agencies are influencing, like the policies and the practices of these platforms. Ultimately, these social networks can be argued to be a front for intelligence services at the end of the day, as far as I'm concerned. Julian Assange, I remember he put it that Facebook was the most appalling spy machine ever invented, or something like that. They really are global spy machines. And now, with something like Instagram, all these that Facebook owns, by the way, think about the danger of like how much information they have on people. And of course, these intelligence agencies, they don't have these companies have created spy tools that these um that the CIA and the NSA could never have even imagined would exist. And of course, it's an amazing opportunity for them to have a panopticon of surveillance. And now, with just the level, the extent to which these companies, like a company like Amazon, is just taking over every aspect of our lives. It's just, I mean,
Yeah,
it's incredible. And people don't think about this stuff.
no, that's and the scariest part is that people willingly post their entire lives onto these platforms.
Yeah. We're all guilty of it to some extent. I certainly am. As a journalist and a public figure, it's like, there's nothing inherently wrong with the technology itself, but there's a huge problem when you consider whose hands it's in and what is being done with your information. You don't have any say over it. These privacy agreements, are really, they have the level of control they have over the government. I mean, how much some people's entire lives are stored on Facebook, and it's in their hands, like you don't have real control over all this information that they've compiled over, the 20 some odd years that it's been around.
Well,
And that's
well,
very
too,
dangerous.
like with Amazon, for example, people have been putting in Ring cameras, which, have like they, monitor who comes up to your house. But if you have a neighborhood and like multiple people have Ring cameras, the Ring cameras all connect and like communicate to each other. And then two, it's owned by Amazon. So where do you think all that information is going? Like it's
Yeah, it's very
kind
disturbing. It's really spooky and Orwellian, to say the least. And the internet itself, I think a lot of people don't realize, was largely established due to an intelligence related endeavor. We were talking about DARPA earlier, which was the agency responsible for developing all these cutting edge technologies for, they were developed for military intelligence and national security reasons. At the time, it was called ARPANET. And as it was originally known, as I mentioned before. And that was the first network of computers. I think it was originally four supercomputers that it connected to handle, these massive transmissions of data. And I mentioned the Telecommunications Act and the National Science Foundation. Um, Eventually, ARPANET delegated the operations to the National Science Foundation, uh, and it multiplied that network across thousands of universities, and then eventually it brought it to the public at large, and in doing so created the architecture or the structure of the World Wide Web as we know it today. And Silicon Valley, the case is very similar. By the mid 90s, the intelligence community was investing massive amounts of money in computer science. This is where Google comes in. They were investing massive amounts of money in the research arms of the NSA and the CIA, and the tech industry and the Defense Department have always maintained very close ties, have been joined at the hip. And, like I was saying earlier, there's this big myth propagated by big tech that it's entrepreneurship that's what brought her out, this technological revolution. When it was, after the Second World War, there was that big boom where there was comprehensive and steady government funding and military contracting to keep up with the Soviets. That's what made, Northern California and the Bay Area the hub of the tech industry. It was not private entrepreneurship. It was massive government funding. And what later became, Google, the search engine, and actually, if you look at the official bios, even like the Wikipedia pages, the official story of Google, anywhere you see, they always leave this out, that its creators, they were PhD students at Stanford University. I mean, they don't leave that part out, but they leave apart the DARPA funding that they got. They always mention the National Science Foundation and also the massive digital data systems project, which was or I'm sorry, they mentioned DARPA and the National Science Foundation, but they always leave out the massive digital data systems project because that had ties to the intelligence community. They never mentioned that in the Wikipedia. That's where they were, the Sergey Brin and Larry Page, who were the founders of Google. They were these PhD students at Stanford, and they got funding and grants, not just from DARPA and the National Science Foundation, but also from MDDS, which was launched by the intelligence community. And they were making rapid progress in like web page ranking and like, as a search engine, um, tracking and making sense of the user queries that were put in to make this big, massive digital library out of the internet so people could search through it using prompts and queries through a vast set of data. That innovation, that came from research grants provided by the intelligence community.
Well,
And it's to me, it's very suspicious the way that they always leave that out uh, of their
well,
official story.
well, too, I could be remembering incorrectly, but when I read Surveillance Valley by Yasha Levine, which is all about the military origins of the internet, I believe he was talking about that they put in into Google, they put in a backdoor whereby like an intelligence agent could go in and then look at what one person, all the different places they'd been on the internet.
Yeah, well, that's something that Edward Snowden really revealed heavily. I don't know if it's precisely the same thing, but basically, there's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act stipulates that like law enforcement or intelligence agencies, in order to access your private information, like your email, your computer, whatever, they have to have probable cause. They can't just violate your civil rights. But what they can do, there's loopholes basically in the FISA law. And one of them is like what they can do is catch a bunch of data like internet traffic and through a back door they can make sense of the information um, that way. That was one of the things that he blew the whistle on. I mean, FISA was established actually after the Church Committee in the 1970s. It's funny because I have a forthcoming article about David Horowitz, and he was one of the journalists at the time at Ramparts. But basically, the first NSA whistleblower was this guy uh, whose name was Perry Fellwalk, and he had worked for the NSA, which at the time in the early 70s was still secret. It had been created in the 50s under Harry Truman, and it was not disclosed to the public, even though its budget exceeded that of the CIA, actually. And they had, had this massive surveillance program that could monitor communications globally and was totally violating the Constitution, monitoring the private communications of Americans. They were even spying on U.S. allies. Of course, this was all in the context of the Cold War, encountering the Soviets. And so he came forth to Ramparts magazine, and he blew the whistle on the existence of the NSA. And that was one of many intelligence abuses that had occurred at the time, along with this occurred right after Watergate. And so that led to the Church Committee. And after the Church Committee, they passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that was supposed to curb the ability of intelligence agencies into monitoring communications. Of course, then 9/11 came and that changed everything. And the Bush administration started openly violating FISA. And so Edward Snowden in 2013, he was an NSA contractor. And he came forth and he blew the whistle on many things related to the NSA surveillance program. And one of the things that he blew the whistle on was that there's this a practice known as backdoor searching, where they can sweep up a vast array of internet traffic and countless people's internet searches, their emails, documents, usernames, passwords, even your conversations on a video conference platform like Zoom. I mean, at the time, with Snowden, this is 2013, so it was Skype, which is now defunct. But the same thing, basically, meaning they can capture vast swaths of data and everyone's internet activity with their servers, and they could store billions of records and search within it. And I mean, it's been over 10 years since the Snowden revelations. Congress and the FISA court, they've since imposed modest limitations on these backdoor searches, but since the Snowden revelations, but this is over 10 years ago now. I mean, who knows what they can do now? I mean, he also revealed this thing called X key score, which showed that, they have the technological capacity to, to do this loophole, this legal that gives the intelligence agency like the NSA the legal authority basically to target even American citizens for extensive electronic surveillance without a warrant, just by using their email or their IP address. I mean, Edward Snowden went as far as to say, like, if I had your email, I could wiretap you. Like, that's all it takes.
Right.
Under U.S. law, I mean, the NSA is required to obtain an individualized FISA warrant if they're, but that's if who you're communicating with is a U.S. person. But they actually don't need a warrant for intercepting the communications of Americans with foreign targets. There's like various loopholes under the different sections of FISA. I think it's section 702 of FISA that allows them to do this, like if the surveillance is related to international communications. So if you're in contact with foreign targets, they don't need a warrant to read your email, and they can get around the Fourth Amendment, basically, which stipulates that law enforcement agencies have to have a warrant based on probable cause to surveil your private communications.
Yeah, the mention of Snowden, I want brings me to Tor technology, which I'd like to talk about for a bit. Tor technology was sold, and actually Snowden really promoted it as this great privacy technology, which, you know, everyone needs to use to keep safe from the government. Because what Tor does is it basically hides where you've been on the internet by sort of scrambling your tracks. But actually, the Tor technology is extremely helpful for CIA operatives in other countries because it would allow spies to log on to CIA pages without the foreign government being that they're under being able to detect it. But the only problem with Tor was that if only CIA operatives used it, then it would be a giveaway. So for Tor to actually work hiding CIA agents, the biggest amount of people possible needed to use it. And the origins of it start in 1995 with the Naval Research Laboratory, funded by DARPA and the Office of Naval Research. They began to develop onion routing, which was basically which is what Tor is, which obscured where one had been on the internet. The project was fairly unsuccessful, though, until 2002, when a few new people joined the board, namely Roger Dingledine, who's Tor project director and co-founder, and then as well as Nick Mathewson. They were not formally employed by the Naval Laboratory, but were contractors for DARPA. Working on the project of onion routing, they eventually came up with Tor. So even though Tor has long been advertised as a completely independent endeavor, at the Wizards of OS conference in Germany in 2004, Dingleton actually spoke about being on the Pentagon's payroll. He said, quote, "I forgot to mention earlier something that will make you look at me in a new light. I contract for the United States government to build anonymity technology for them and deploy it. They don't think of it as anonymity technology, although we use that term. They think of it as security technology. They need these technologies so they can research people they're interested in, so they can have anonymous tip lines, so that they can buy things from people without other countries knowing what they're buying, how much they're buying, and where it is going, that sort of thing." Close quote. And actually, too, obviously, understanding Tor's use as a tool for agents to foment regime change, Dingledine wrote to the director of US AGM, which I'll explain what that is in a minute, that, quote, "We also need to think about a strategy for how to spin this move in terms of Tor's overall direction. I would guess that we don't want to loudly declare war on China since that only harms our goals," close quote. So USAGM brings us to the OTF, which is short for the Open Technology Fund, which produced the messaging app Signal as well as Tor. It gave $3 million to Signal and $6 million to Tor between 2012 and 2020, which is funded by USAGM. USAGM is short for United States Agency for Global Media, which oversees U.S. media outlets like Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. So the OTF was originally managed by Radio Free Asia, which is like the version of Radio Free Europe, but directed at China. So although the OTF was a government body until 2019, it describes itself as an independent nonprofit organization committed to advancing global internet freedom, and that it, quote, "supports projects focused on counteracting repressive censorship and surveillance, enabling citizens worldwide to exercise their fundamental human rights online." And I mean, if you're familiar at all with the CIA's regime change promoting language, this should ring a bell. Actually, sort of back to how the Communist Party of China has been pretty strategic about this internet stuff. The OTF actually emerged because in 1996, Beijing began blocking Radio Free Asia's website. So then, of course, the CIA searched for a way to circumvent this, hence the OTF. And actually, the OTF channeled millions of dollars to the 2019-2020 Hong Kong protest leaders too, and it also sponsored the development of Siphon, which is an open source tool that allows users to bypass the Cuban government's restrictions. Um, and the supposedly now non-governmental OTF has a board which is entirely composed of former state functionaries. Actually, one of them was worked under Reagan as just funny. But I guess my point being is that like Tor, which has been promoted as this technology for internet privacy,
Mhm.
is used by the CIA because like and the promotion of freedom from censorship on the internet, like they're used also can be used as weapons of the intelligence agencies.
Yeah, well, I think I mean, I'm not super familiar with Tor, but what you're saying, it sounds very similar to the questions or controversy around the Signal. It seems very similar. I mean, a lot of the whole internet freedom movement, a lot of the things that they're promoting as ways to get around, the surveillance state can actually become things that are used that to do the very opposite. Um, so I'm not really surprised to hear that. I mean, and the other thing with, as earth-shattering as the Snowden revelations were, I mean, the big questions to me were, I mean, they were originally came out in the Guardian newspaper, when Greenwald was working at the time, and there's a documentary Citizen 4. If people haven't seen it, it's worth seeing. But, though a lot of those revelations continued with the Intercept, which Greenwald was involved in the launching of, and he's since been expelled um, after the whole Hunter Biden thing. But the problem with the Intercept and First Look Media is that it's owned by Pierre Omidyar, who is a big tech oligarch himself, and is one of the founders of both eBay and PayPal, who are some of the biggest backers of NSA surveillance. So what's his motive? It makes you wonder, like, what's his motivation for, establishing this website that's all about, blowing the whistle on the surveillance state. And then also that coupled with the fact that the internet intercept numerous whistleblowers that ended up leaking to them, not just Reality Winner, but several other people, ended up going to prison and getting immediately after, leaking to the intercept, they ended up going to jail. So there's a lot of questions around that too. I mean, and Pierre Omidyar, his NGOs have been linked to stuff like the Maidan protests in Ukraine and all kinds of stuff. So he's clearly some kind of soft power asset or something. So Yasha Levine's criticisms of Tor and the so-called internet freedom movement, how the military, I guess Tor has U.S. Navy origins, right? So
Mhm.
I don't know too much about it, so I'm not going to comment too much. But I have read other criticisms of the cyber libertarian, you know, internet freedom movement and how something like Signal or Tor could just be another NSA honeypot. But I mean, I think that nevertheless, like Snowden's revelations, it did kickstart like a global discussion that needed to be had on the incompatibility between the right to individual privacy and national security. I mean, he didn't just reveal the cooperation between like telecommunications companies and Western governments. But like I was saying, things like X key score, which was a NSA program that allowed analysts to search, with no prior authorization through vast databases of internet traffic containing your emails, online chats, the browsing histories of millions of people, and that essentially any individual could be wiretapped using their personal email with NSA spy tools. They can access your email and conduct warrantless surveillance on you. I mean, as far as what I was saying about Google, it's not that like the founders of Google got grants from the intelligence community. It's not to say that Google was created by the CIA. It's not even to say that. It's that what Google ended up achieving as a search engine was something that the intelligence community from the very beginning was hoping that it would create and help make possible. So these things, while they are useful, they are intimately connected with uh, the goals of the intelligence security apparatus and complex, and you know what its ideal goals in terms of surveillance and keeping tabs on the entire world, and disguising it, giving it a cover as just something that people can use to document their lives and communicate with each other, and that's what makes it so dangerous, is because people use these things and they don't realize what they truly are. A lot of that has really gotten lost in the conversation. I mean, there are now, all these big antitrust lawsuits happening about the monopoly that these companies have on the market, something like Amazon, in terms of destroying competition, actual competition, but not as much attention is being given to I mean, and there's also a lot of talk about the massive amounts of wealth as this new class of oligarchs been created, but not enough attention has been given into the military and intelligence aspects to the internet and these big tech giants and social media companies. And that's something that really needs to be fleshed out.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, you see people acting like Trump's cozying up with these tech oligarchs is somehow surprising or shocking, but a lot of these same people have early on but like sort of got their start with getting military contracts and government contracts to even sort of that was what even set them on their way, so to speak. Like I believe like Elon Musk started out by getting a ton of military contracts and
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, and people have made a big deal about the fact that Jeff Bezos, who had previously had kind of an ambivalent or even critical relationship with Trump, did an about face, and, of course, was there at the inauguration for that bizarre spectacle with his, trophy wife. But, people were not, I mean, this is not a new development. I mean, it can't go without mentioning the close relationship too between the CIA and Amazon, which is headquartered in Seattle, not the Bay Area, but nevertheless, it has a very big presence in Silicon Valley. And its partnership with the CIA, is it's said to be mostly based on cloud computing. I mean, Amazon provides the cloud infrastructure for the CIA. Believe it was in 2013. It was actually very scandalous at the time. And I remember there was even like Nation magazine article about it, I think, that got mysteriously scrubbed from the internet. But basically, at that time, Amazon secured a $600 million contract with the CIA, which was very controversial because uh, that same year, Bezos also bought the Washington Post. And obviously that's a tremendous conflict of interest to have one of America's, largest newspapers, their foreign policy coverage reporting on intelligence related matters. It's obviously going to be compromised to have its, you know, uh, megalomaniacal, uh, oligarchic owner, his company providing services to the CIA in a private cloud system. And especially when they're not even disclosing that conflict of interest, like in the articles, like when people are reading a WAPO article about something related to the CIA, they're not disclosing that the owner is doing this. And they're supposed to be a political paper of note. And so they're not disclosing this to their readers. And Amazon Web Services, it secured that contract. And then a few years later, it extended it now to the tune of billions of dollars. And obviously, this raised a lot of concerns about transparency, considering Amazon's broader business interests. And Bezos also at one point was invited to sit on a Pentagon board. I think it was the Defense Innovation Board, it's called, which is a advisory board to the Defense Department. And I guess he wasn't able to join it ultimately for security reasons because he would have been related to classified knowledge, or he would have been privy to classified knowledge. Um, and so I guess he couldn't get security clearance. But like, nevertheless, he was nominated, and the relationship financially and otherwise between something like Amazon and the CIA is very intimate, and they're totally in bed with one another. And Amazon, by the way, also has like procurement programs that tailor to government agencies like the State Department, so they can, in order to speed up the process, like of acquiring desks and chairs and office supplies and all the stuff that they need, they can go directly to Amazon. And that they provide that in addition to the cloud infrastructure. And on top of that, Bezos owns Whole Foods. So if you want to buy your overpriced health food from the CIA, you can shop there. I mean, it's so spooky and
Well,
creepy. But this is the techno feudalist, techno fascist world we live in today.
the scariest thing is that aside from the technological innovations, it's not really that different from when the CIA got its start. Like I just finished reading The Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot. And, like Alan Dulles and sort of and his crowd were all very close to like the Wall Street bankers and the Rockefellers and these.
Mhm.
And so it's like now those sorts of people have been sort of replaced by these tech people, but it's the same thing of this this merging of the government with these very powerful, wealthy families and individuals, which
As
is
George Carlin used to say, it's a big club and you ain't in it. They
well,
all go to the same country clubs and universities and all that.
I was gonna say it's become, you know, we're sort of told like that in a democracy, the government is different than the corporate interests, and this sort of whole notion of a ruling class is obscured when if you look back at the history, it's certainly more out in the open and worse now, but it's, been the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie for some time. So,
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right to make those comparisons. And I mean, it is the same. And it's this revolving door between like the tech industry and the government and the inordinate influence that these tech companies have over the government, over the media, over, I mean, this has always existed. It's just taken a slightly different form, and it's something that this new class of oligarchs, like I was saying, they grew out of the privatization of something that should have been and still should be a public utility that's publicly owned. Uh, and instead, you've got, a company like Amazon paying virtually nothing in taxes. I mean, despite the amount of wealth that he's amassing. I mean, Musk has since eclipsed him as the richest person in the world, but it's just obscene. I mean, I think what does he make, like $400,000 a minute or something, they say? I mean, it's something, might even be more than that. Um, but it's just disgusting. And yeah, there's a lot of talk about Amazon's labor practices and like I said, these antitrust lawsuits that have been brought, but I don't think it has been discussed as much the relationship with the intelligence community and just the whole nature of these technological innovations as being in the service of soft power and surveillance. And it's the internet is not what it appears to be. It really is not. And neither are these social networks that encompass it. um, and I think I mean, we could probably spend a whole episode just on the social networks alone, and their usage. But I mean, and there's been lots of talk, like about like since the 2016 election, the way that these tech platforms have been used to manipulate elections. Of course, they've also made up a bunch of shit, demon Russia, saying that Russia, took out internet ads with, the devil and Jesus arm wrestling, and that's like what swayed people from not voting for Hillary and voting for Trump, and saying that Russia meddled in the 2016 election. Meanwhile, Cambridge Analytica is like building these digital profiles of everybody, using the data that Facebook compiles on people, to build, profiles, like to us, really for social engineering purposes. That these kinds of things can be used to, yes, manipulate elections. And of course, none of the conversation is ever about other countries that could be doing this, namely like a country like Israel, for example.
I think just in regards to the whole, this is kind of just a random interjection, I guess, but in regards to the whole Trump and Russia thing, I think it's become very obvious this time that Trump's not just Putin's puppet, as was sort of painted for some time.
Yeah, I
And
mean, there have been a lot of revelations recently. Yeah. Yeah, about how that whole thing was cooked up. Yeah, I mean, that's for sure. But I mean, it is true though that these platforms nevertheless can be uh, weaponized for social engineering purposes and for manipulating things politically, and that's definitely the case. Yeah, so I think this has been a very good discussion. Did you have any final thoughts, Shayna?
yes, actually, as I mentioned, reading that book, The Devil's Chessboard, it was making me think, we often say, oh, these companies are in bed with the CIA, they're working for the CIA. But you could turn it on your head and say that sort of the intelligence agencies and that part of the government is sort of the arm of the government controlled by the corporations and these powerful figures and business interests. Because like what I was saying with Alan Dulles, I mean, having close connections to like Wall Street and the Rockefellers. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
I think so. Yeah, I think people are very naive about about that aspect of American history. And it is absurd to talk about this level of control like that people like Musk and Bezos and Zuckerberg have. Yes, of course, these tools, these apparatuses that they have, and when all three of them are flanking Trump at his inauguration, almost just this brash, display of like, yeah, we're in control here. I think people are very naive as far as like about American history, that the way that, like historically, like the big American industrialists, the old money, the level of influence that they had, it's not really a new development. It's just one that's taken a different shape. And
It's more overt and it's more technologically enabled.
yes.
So it's more noticeable, but it's something that has always sort of always been there.
And I mean the industrialists, I mean they enrich themselves, over, through whether it was railroads or oil, it was a technological innovation. It was a different kind, but it was nevertheless it was a class that was created in the transition from feudalism to capitalism and then subsequently industrialization. But it's not really any different. And actually you could argue probably that those people actually had greater wealth, at least. I don't know about in terms of control, it's probably maybe comparable, but in terms of wealth, I think ratio wise, they actually the Carnegies and Rockefellers and all of them, they probably actually had, or Vanderbilts, they probably had more money. It just appears, I mean, it's just the amount of money that Musk and Bezos have is just so incalculable. I mean, the fact that we're approaching, that Musk might become a trillionaire. I mean, and the absurd thing about all this is like, there's people today that like think that like, okay, well, Musk and Bezos and them, well, that's the counted money, and like they'll say, okay, well, we don't really know how much money, like say, like the king of Saudi Arabia has, or Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, because like, are we real? Are we really counting the full amount of money that they have? I mean, and then of course there's these absurd accusations that Putin is the richest man in the world because he.
Wait, what? I haven't
Yeah.
seen that.
Oh yeah, there's people that swear that because that Putin renationalized, the oil and gas industry, which had been privatized in Russia in the 90s, that because he's absorbed a lot, reabsorbed a lot of the privatization that went on, that it's not being tallied and that Putin actually has trillions of dollars, which is absurd. I mean, yeah, he's seen with like a nice watch and stuff, but like his lifestyle, I mean, as far as I know, is not anywhere near on par with like, um, I mean, he's certainly doing a good job hiding it. I mean, yeah, he's definitely rich, but like the idea that he's the richest, wealthiest person in the world, I think is patently absurd. The question of like the Gulf monarchies, I think you could be maybe they might have as much or more money based on the fact that they're absolute theocratic dictatorships and they have control over oil resources. But I don't know. I think it's a complicated question. I mean, yeah, of course, like, is the truly richest person really going to fully disclose that? Probably not. But um, either way, like what we were saying about the level of influence that the ruling class has over our sham of a democracy is not a new development. But anyway, so we wanted to thank everybody for tuning in, and please hit like and subscribe if you're watching us on Substack. We have a YouTube channel, it's Captive Minds Pod. If you are watching us on YouTube, we have a Substack, it's shaenahbatterson.substack.com. We also have an X page, it's Captive Minds X, where you can follow us there. Please hit like and subscribe and leave any comments. We'd love to hear back from you. But we'll be back either next week or the following with another episode of Captive Minds. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.